The night was alive with music and laughter as Amara stepped into the glowing lights of the grand house in Accra. The birthday party was one of those gatherings where everyone wanted to be seen. Wealthy guests dressed in their best clothes, glasses of champagne in hand, and cameras flashing. Amara had been invited because, like it or not, she was family. She walked in quietly, hoping to blend in, but all eyes found her anyway. Just as she was about to greet a few familiar faces, a sharp voice cut through the air. "Here comes the orphan girl." It was her cousin, his words dripping with cruelty. For a moment, the crowd went silent, then laughter burst out across the room. Some people covered their mouths, pretending it wasn't funny, while others laughed openly, enjoying the moment. Amara froze, the words striking harder than any slap. She felt her chest tighten as the mocking echoes surrounded her. The word orphan was not just a reminder of her past. It was a label she had carried her whole life, one that seemed impossible to escape. Her cousin smiled proudly, as if humiliating her was a kind of entertainment. Guests she had never met before whispered, turning their heads to get a better look at her, the girl they now saw as an outsider in her own family. Amara forced herself to keep her chin up. Inside, the pain burned deep, but outwardly, she refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. Amara's earliest memories were not of laughter or bedtime stories, but of cold mornings in Kumasi where she woke up before everyone else to sweep the compound. She was just a little girl, yet her small hands were already used to carrying buckets of water, scrubbing floors, and peeling cassava until her fingers ached. Her parents were gone before she even understood what it meant to have parents, and so she was left in the care of her aunt, a woman who made sure Amara never forgot she was not truly wanted. "You are nothing but a burden," her aunt would say almost daily. The words sank into her heart like stone. Whenever food was served, Amara was given the smallest portion. If clothes were bought for the other children, hers were always the hand-me-downs, torn, faded, sometimes barely fitting. On holidays, when her cousins were dressed up and taken out, she was told to stay behind and mind the house. Watching them leave while she sat alone in the quiet rooms was a kind of loneliness no child should ever feel. She learned quickly that tears only made things worse. If she cried, her aunt would snap, "Do you think crying will bring your parents back?" So Amara stopped crying. She carried her pain silently, keeping it tucked away inside her like a secret she was too afraid to share. At night, when everyone else slept, she would whisper to herself in the dark, promising that one day she would escape this life. Still, there were moments of small light. Sometimes, she would run errands in the busy Kumasi market, and the colors of the Kent cloths, the voices of the sellers, and the smell of roasted plantain gave her a sense of freedom, even if only for an hour. She would watch other children laughing with their mothers and fathers, and though it hurt, it also gave her hope. She imagined what it might feel like to be loved like that, to belong to someone who saw her as more than a burden. But when she returned home, reality always greeted her. Her aunt's sharp eyes watched every move, quick to find fault. If Amara sat too long, she was lazy. If she spoke too little, she was ungrateful. No matter what she did, it was never enough. The house felt less like a home and more like a place she was trapped in. Over the years, Amara built an invisible armor. She trained herself to endure without complaint, to survive on scraps of kindness, to hold her head high even when her heart was heavy. Though the loneliness carved deep scars, it also shaped her into someone strong. She grew quiet, observant, and resilient. She may have been called a burden, but deep down, she began to believe that one day, the same pain that tried to break her would become the fire that set her free. The people laughing at Amara that night in Accra thought they knew her story. To them, she was still the helpless orphan from Kumasi, the girl who grew up in someone else's shadow. But what none of them realized was that the girl they mocked had built a life far beyond their imagination. Behind her quiet smile and calm presence was a woman who carried a strength they could not see. Amara had turned her pain into purpose. Years ago, when she finally gained her independence, she promised herself that no child would ever feel as unwanted as she once did. With that vow in her heart, she started a small group that supported Orphan, her community. At first, it was just her saving every little sadie she could, buying school supplies, or paying fees for a child who would have dropped out. She knocked on doors, wrote letters, and asked for help wherever she could find it. Slowly, her passion caught the attention of others. What began as one girl's effort grew into a registered charity that now operates across several African countries. Amara became the founder of an organization that feeds children, pays their school fees, and even builds small homes for those without family. She often traveled between cities, Accra, Lagos, Nairobi, Johannesburg, meeting leaders, speaking at conferences, and gathering support from people who shared her vision. Powerful men and women admired her determination, and many of them became her allies. Some gave her funding, Others opened doors she never thought she would walk through. Yet Amara never flaunted her success. She moved quietly, allowing the work to speak for itself. When she walked into orphanages, children ran to her with open arms, calling her Mama Amara. Volunteers respected her for her humility and drive. She was not interested in titles or recognition. Her joy came from seeing a child smile on the first day of school, or watching a teenager who once slept on the streets graduate with a scholarship in hand. Her connections ran deeper than her relatives in Accra could ever guess. Presidents had shaken her hand. Influential businesspeople had her number saved in their phone. Even celebrities from outside Africa had donated to her cause after hearing her story. Amara knew how to move in circles of power, but she never let it change who she was at the core. She carried her past with her, not as shame, but as proof of how far she had come. So while her cousins whispered insults and laughed at her pain, Amara remained still, her face unreadable. If only they knew that the orphan girl they mocked was the same woman making real change across Africa. If only they knew she had built a name more powerful than their family's wealth and gossip. She didn't need to shout or prove anything that night, because the truth was already hers. She was no longer a victim of her past, but the author of her own future. Amara sat at the long dinner table, her posture calm even though her cousins kept stealing glances at her, waiting for another chance to throw a jab. The chandeliers above sparkled, glasses clinked, and waiters moved about with trays of wine. But beneath the glamour, there was an undercurrent of malice that she could feel. Her cousin Chitty, always loud and eager to impress, leaned back in his chair with a smirk. He raised his voice just enough so the surrounding guests could hear. "You know," he said, swirling his drink as if he were making an important announcement, "Amara will never marry into wealth. No respectable family wants an orphan." The words landed like a knife. For a second, the table froze, then laughter exploded all around her. Some laughed because they thought it was funny. Others laughed simply to join in, afraid of being left out. The sound was sharp and cruel, echoing through Amara's chest. Chitty grinned wider, pleased with himself, watching her for a reaction. Amara's cousins leaned in closer, whispering and chuckling, their eyes flashing with a mixture of mockery and jealousy. One of the aunts nearby shook her head in fake pity, whispering loudly, "It's true, who would want her?" The laughter swelled again, louder this time, feeding off one another like a fire. Inside, Amara felt the sting, but she didn't let it show. She took a sip of her water, steady and calm, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. Her silence made them laugh harder, as if her composure was a weakness instead of strength. But in truth, her calmness was her shield. Chitty wasn't done. He leaned forward, lowering his voice just enough to make it sound like a secret, but still audible to everyone nearby. "She can dress up and smile all she wants, but an orphan remains an orphan. No husband, no inheritance, no real name to carry forward." His words dripped with venom, designed to humiliate her completely. The table erupted again. Forks tapped against plates, hands covered mouths to hide giggles, and faces turned to her, eager to see her crack. Amara's heart tightened, but her mind was already elsewhere. She reminded herself of the children she supported, of the lives she had touched, of the people who respected her far beyond this room. Compared to that, the cruelty at this table was small. Still, she couldn't ignore the weight of their laughter. It was the same sound she had heard all her life, mocking, doubting, dismissing. Yet this time, she was different. She was no longer the powerless girl in Kumasi. She looked at Chitty, her eyes steady, and for a moment he faltered, uncomfortable under her calm gaze. They thought they had won with their mockery, but Amara knew something they didn't. The night was not over, and soon, the same voices that laughed at her would be silenced by a truth they could never have imagined. Amara sat through the laughter until the table grew too loud to bear. Chitty was still riding on the attention, making jokes at her expense, each one sharper than the last. She smiled faintly, almost as if his words barely touched her, then placed her napkin gently on the table. With quiet grace, she pushed back her chair and stood. "I need a little air," she said softly, her voice steady. Nobody expected her to leave so calmly. Some cousins smirked, whispering that she couldn't handle the heat. Others chuckled, convinced they had chased her away. Amara ignored them, gliding out of the hall and into the quieter corridors of the mansion. Once she was out of sight, she slipped her phone from her clutch. Her fingers moved with ease, dialing a number she had memorized long ago. When the call connected, she didn't bother with greetings. Her voice was calm, low, and certain. "It's time. Come get me." On the other end, the reply was simple. "We're on our way." Amara hung up, her face unreadable. She knew what was coming, and for the first time that evening, her chest loosened. She leaned against the wall for a moment, taking a deep breath, steadying herself for the storm that was about to turn in her favor. Meanwhile, back at the table, Chitty noticed her absence and left. "She probably went to cry in the bathroom," he said loudly, drawing another round of chuckles. One of the younger cousins asked where she went, and Chitty smirked. Oh, she's pretending she has someone important to call. Don't mind her. Amara doesn't know anyone worth knowing. The table erupted again, but this time, a few guests looked uneasy. Some of them wondered about the quiet confidence in Amara's face when she stood. It wasn't the look of someone broken. It was the look of someone holding a secret. Chitty, however, was too blinded by his pride to notice. He leaned back, sipping his drink, bragging about his own connections. Me, I have friends in government, people in business. But Amara? Who does she know? Maybe the woman who sells tomatoes in Kumasi Market. The laughter rang out again, cruel and loud. But Amara wasn't bothered. As she made her way slowly back to the hall, her phone slipped back into her clutch. Her calm steps carried her past curious guests who smiled politely, unaware of what was unfolding. Her silence now carried power, because while they laughed, she knew the truth. In just a few minutes, the very same family that mocked her would see a different side of Amara. The orphan girl they thought they knew was about to show them exactly who she had become. And when the cars arrived outside, their laughter would turn into shock. The party was in full swing when the sudden screech of tires outside pulled everyone's attention. The music softened as curious guests turned their heads toward the tall glass doors of the mansion. Outside, headlights cut through the night. One by one, sleek black cars rolled up the driveway, polished so bright they reflected the glow of the chandeliers from inside. Valets rushed forward, scrambling to open the doors. From the first car, men in tailored suits stepped out, moving with quiet authority. Their presence alone was enough to silence the laughter that had filled the room only minutes before. People leaned in, whispering, wondering who could arrive at this hour with such a dramatic entrance. Then came the moment that shifted the entire night. From the last car, the door opened slowly, and out stepped a tall man in a perfectly cut suit. His face was instantly recognizable. Kwame Mensah, one of the most powerful and wealthiest men in Ghana, a man whose name carried weight across Africa. Gasps filled the hall. Cameras flashed as though it were a red carpet. Guests craned their necks for a better view, stunned by the presence of someone who rarely appeared at such parties. But the true shock came seconds later. Kwame didn't step forward alone. He turned slightly, reached back, and gently helped Amara out of the car. She emerged with calm grace, her hands secure in his. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Her cousins, who had mocked her endlessly, sat frozen in disbelief. Whispers spread like wildfire through the crowd. Is that Amara? Someone whispered. Another voice followed, trembling with surprise. That's her husband? The disbelief on their faces was almost comical. Guests who had laughed minutes earlier now stared with wide eyes, struggling to piece together what they were seeing. Kwame's presence changed everything. He didn't just walk, he commanded the space. And as he walked into the mansion, his hand still holding Amara's, every camera turned toward them. Guests lifted their phones to capture the moment, desperate to document the scene that no one had expected. Amara walked beside him, her chin high, her steps measured. She didn't need to say a word. The sight of her with one of Ghana's most influential men was enough. Every insult, every cruel laugh from earlier now hung in the air like smoke, choking the very people who had spoken them. Chitty's jaw dropped, his drink forgotten on the table. He blinked as if trying to wake from a dream. No, it can't be, he muttered under his breath, but even he knew the truth was staring him in the face. Amara met his eyes briefly as she entered the hall, her expression calm and unreadable. She didn't gloat, didn't smirk, didn't need to. Her presence alone, her hand in Kwame's, was louder than any comeback she could have given. In that single entrance, the orphan girl became the center of the room, and the laughter that once humiliated her was replaced with silence, awe, and a rising tide of envy. The hall had gone so quiet you could hear the soft hum of the air conditioning. Every pair of eyes followed Kwame and Amara as they walked in hand. The same guests who had laughed only moments earlier now sat stiff in their chairs, their smiles frozen, unsure whether to clap or keep silent. The energy in the room shifted, like a wave crashing down and sweeping away the cruelty that had filled the air before. Kwame, tall and confident, paused at the center of the room. He gave a polite nod to the host of the party, then turned to face the curious, stunned crowd. His voice was warm yet firm, the kind that silenced murmurs without effort. Good evening, he began. Forgive us for arriving late. His eyes scanned the room, lingering for a second on the table where Chitty and the cousins sat. They shifted uncomfortably in their seats, suddenly wishing they could disappear. Then, with a gentle smile, Kwame pulled Amara a little closer. Allow me to introduce my wife, he said clearly, his words carrying across the hall. This is Amara, the woman who changed my life. Gasps rippled through the crowd. For some, it felt like the ground had been pulled from beneath their feet. The same girl they had mocked as an orphan was not only standing beside one of Ghana's wealthiest men, she was his wife. The weight of those words crushed the laughter that had filled the room earlier. Faces turned pale, drinks were lowered mid-sip, and a heavy silence followed, broken only by hurried whispers. "She's his wife," one guest murmured, barely able to believe it. Another whispered back, "Kwame Mensah married her? How?" The disbelief spread from table to table, while Amara stood gracefully, her hand still resting in Kwame's, her expression calm but powerful. Chitty's smirk had completely vanished. His mouth hung slightly open, and his eyes darted around, searching for someone to laugh with, but no one dared. The room no longer found his jokes amusing. His earlier words, "No respectable family wants an orphan," now sounded foolish and cruel, echoing back at him like an insult aimed at himself. Kwame continued speaking, his voice steady and commanding. "Many of you may know me for business, for wealth, for the name Mensah. But what you don't know is that none of that compares to what I have found in this woman. She is not just my wife, she is my strength, my inspiration, my partner in everything." The guests clapped hesitantly at first, then more firmly, though the sound carried an uneasiness. It was the applause of people caught off guard, forced to acknowledge a truth they had tried to bury. Amara's cousins clapped too, their hands stiff, their faces pale, their shame obvious. In that moment, the mockery dissolved completely. The orphan girl label vanished. Before them stood not a victim of pity, but a woman loved and honored by a man whose name carried power across nations. And no one in that room dared laugh again. The moment Kwame finished speaking, the air in the room shifted again. The silence was broken not by more laughter, but by a sudden rush of clinking glasses and nervous chatter. Those who had mocked Amara now scrambled to adjust their faces, forcing smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. It was almost amusing. Just minutes ago, they had laughed at her pain, and now they tripped over themselves trying to get closer to her. One aunt stood up first, her gold bangles jingling as she hurried toward the couple. "Amara, my dear," she exclaimed, her voice too sweet, too forced. "You look so beautiful tonight. I always knew you would make us proud." She clasped Amara's hands tightly, squeezing a little too hard, as if trying to erase years of cruelty with one fake gesture. Behind her came two cousins, the same ones who had giggled the loudest at Chitty's jokes. "Sister Amara," one said quickly, "you should have told us. We would have celebrated you properly." The other added, Yes, you've always been special. We see it now." Their smiles were wide, but their eyes carried fear, the fear of being remembered for their cruelty. Even Chitty tried to recover, though his pride made it harder. He stood up slowly, brushing invisible dust off his expensive jacket, and walked over with a stiff grin. "Ah, Amara," he said, his voice suddenly soft and respectful. "We were only joking, family jokes. No malice at all." He laughed weakly, but the sound fell flat. Nobody joined in this time. Amara listened to them all, her face calm and unreadable. She nodded politely, but her eyes carried a distance that made it clear she was not fooled. She didn't lash out or remind them of their cruelty. She didn't need to. Her silence was louder than any speech. Every fake compliment, every nervous laugh only revealed their guilt more clearly. Kwame stood proudly by her side, his presence making their desperation even more obvious. People leaned closer, eager to shake his hand, eager to attach themselves to the power they now saw in Amara. "Mr. Mensah, welcome, one uncle gushed, as if he hadn't ignored Amara earlier. Others bowed their heads slightly, voices dripping with respect. But Amara kept her grace. She smiled politely when necessary, thanked them softly, but never once let herself be swept into their false warmth. Inside, she remembered every laugh, every cruel whisper, every time they had used the word orphan like a weapon. She didn't need revenge. Their shame was already punishment enough. As the crowd swirled with forced cheer, Amara stood tall, her presence commanding without effort. The tables had turned completely. The same relatives who once looked down on her were now the ones looking up, desperate for her approval. And all she had to do was remain calm, her dignity shining brighter than their empty smiles. Dinner was finally served, but the energy in the room was far from relaxed. Plates of steaming jollof rice, grilled fish, and tender goat meat filled the long table, yet most guests barely tasted their food. The earlier laughter had vanished, replaced with stiff smiles and hushed whispers. Every so often, eyes darted toward Amara, studying her as if she were someone entirely new. Kwame sat beside her at the head of the table, his hand occasionally brushing her, his calm presence commanding respect without effort. The guests tried to act natural, forcing small talk, but the tension lingered. Everyone knew the night had changed. Everyone knew the balance of power now sat firmly with the woman they had mocked. Halfway through the meal, Kwame slowly stood up. His tall frame and quiet authority drew instant silence. He raised his glass of wine, the golden light of the chandeliers reflecting off the crystal. All eyes lifted to him. Some guests already looked nervous, guessing what he might say. "I want to make a toast," Kwame began, his voice steady and deep. "To my wife." He turned to Amara, his gaze filled with warmth that silenced even the faintest whispers. Many of you may know her as Amara, but I know her as the woman who changed my life. A hush spread across the table. Guests shifted uncomfortably, realizing where this was going. Kwame didn't falter. She was called Orphan, he continued, his tone sharp enough to cut through the air. But she carries more dignity and strength than anyone I know. She has faced pain most of us cannot imagine, and yet she chose not to be broken. She chose to rise, not just for herself, but for others. That is real wealth. That is real power. Gasps echoed softly across the hall. Several guests lowered their eyes, their earlier cruelty flashing back in their mind. A few cousins fidgeted in their chairs, their forks clinking nervously against their plates. Chitty swallowed hard, his face pale, wishing he could slip under the table. Kwame lifted his glass higher. To Amara, my wife, my partner, my pride. For a moment, silence hung heavy. No one wanted to clap first. Then, slowly, the host of the party started, followed by a few hesitant hands. Soon, the whole table erupted in applause, but the sound was uneven, awkward. It wasn't the joyful clap of celebration. It was the uneasy clap of people caught in their own shame. Amara remained composed, her face calm, her eyes steady as she raised her own glass in quiet acknowledgement. She didn't need to speak. Kwame's words had already said everything. She could feel the weight of every gaze on her, the sting of their regret, the envy of their hearts. As the applause faded, the truth lingered in the air. They had tried to bury her under the word orphan. But tonight, Kwame had turned that very word into a crown. The night drew to a close, and the once buzzing party now carried a strange silence. The laughter that had mocked Amara earlier never returned. Instead, whispers floated in corners, hushed and heavy, as if people were afraid their words might carry too far. Eyes followed her wherever she moved, some filled with regret, others with envy, but none with the arrogance that had greeted her when she first arrived. Kwame stayed close to her side, his hand holding hers firmly, proudly. Together, they walked toward the tall glass doors, the chandeliers above casting a golden glow on their path. Every step Amara took was a quiet declaration that the night belonged to her. She didn't rush, didn't look back, didn't give anyone the satisfaction of another glance. The same cousins who had once laughed now lowered their eyes, pretending to be busy with their plates or drinks. Outside, the sleek cars still waited, engines humming softly in the night air. A few cameras flashed as they stepped out, capturing the image of a couple that seemed untouchable. Him, one of the most powerful men in the country, and her, the woman who had endured cruelty yet now walked out as a symbol of grace and strength. As the doors closed behind her, Amara felt no need for revenge, no need to explain herself. The whispers inside could stay there. She had nothing to prove anymore. She was no longer the orphan girl they tried to shame. She was a woman of influence, a wife, a leader, someone who had turned pain into power. And as she left that night, hand in hand with her husband, she carried herself like someone who had already won.